We begin the readout tonight with a unified display of solidarity in Brussels, where Western leaders stood shoulder to shoulder in an extraordinary series of summits hosted by NATO, the group of 7 industrialized nations, and the European Union.
We gather at the critical time for our security. We are united in condemning the Kremlin's unprovoked aggression and in our support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Western leaders continue to roll out a series of measures to increase the pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin, while avoiding steps that could lead to a wider war on the continent. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the 29 members of the NATO alliance and once again pleaded for a more robust response.
The Ukrainian army has been resisting for a month in unequal conditions, and I have been repeating the same thing for a month now. To save people in our cities, Ukraine needs military assistance without restrictions. We have shown what our standards are capable of and how much we can give to common security in Europe and the world. How much we can do to protect against aggression, against everything we value, what you value. But NATO has yet to show what the alliance can do to save people.
The Ukrainian president also accused Russia of using phosphorus bombs targeting innocent civilians and children. U.S. defense officials say they cannot confirm those allegations. It is difficult to verify the reports without U.S. personnel on the ground. White phosphorus is not banned by international law. Earlier this week, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told CNN that Russia could consider using nuclear weapons if it felt there was, quote, an existential threat on our country. In a press conference, President Biden warned that this could and would trigger a response.
We would respond if he uses it. The nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use.
According to the New York Times, the Biden administration has also assembled a national security team called the Tiger Team to assess various responses if Russia were to expand its war beyond Ukraine or use weapons of mass destruction. In a first, NATO leaders agreed to provide Ukraine with equipment to protect against chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats, as well as additional cybersecurity assistance. A U.S. official told the Associated Press that Western nations were discussing the possibility of providing anti-ship weapons amid concerns that Russia will launch amphibious assaults along the Black Sea coast. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and President Biden warned China, meanwhile, against coming to Moscow's rescue. The leaders of Poland and other countries bordering Ukraine pressed the U.S. and fellow European countries to step up their assistance with the growing refugee crisis. To that point, President Biden announced that the United States would welcome 100,000 Ukrainian refugees with the goal of reuniting families. More than 3.5 million refugees have fled Ukraine in recent weeks, including more than 2 million to Poland. With me now, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ivo Dodler, who is the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and Amna Nawaz, chief correspondent for PBS NewsHour. Thank you both for being here. Mr. Dodler, I want to start with you because I felt that in watching President Zelensky's address to NATO, he posed a question and a challenge that I think is legitimate to ask. If indeed NATO is the strongest military alliance in the world, in effect, then why is it that they seem completely, I won't say impotent, but they seem so reluctant to act for fear of, provoking Vladimir Putin? Putin seems pretty well provoked. He seems pretty unpredictable. And the fact that they're even talking about the fact that he might launch up to nuclear or chemical strikes against Ukraine shows that they know that he's unstable and unpredictable. Then is it contradictory then that NATO takes all of this action to avoid provocation?
Well, I mean, clearly, on the one hand, Zelensky has every right, and if I were in his shoes, would do exactly the same thing and ask for everything he possibly could to help his country to defend itself, up into including sending NATO troops for that purposes. NATO needs to make a calculation about the relative balance between helping Ukraine, and it is doing an awful lot in terms of sending equipment of all kinds, some of which we know about, frankly, some of which we don't know about, providing intelligence information to help the Ukrainians defend themselves, and they're doing a very, very good job at it. And on the other hand, do we want to have a direct confrontation between Russia and the United States and NATO? This is something that since 1945, we've worked very, very hard to avoid having nuclear powers directly engaged in military confrontation. It's a big step. I think President Biden indicated, I think Secretary General Stoltenberg indicated that the discussions at NATO suggested that there is now more serious thought about that possible step, particularly in response to the use of chemical weapons. But it's not something that you do willy-nilly. There are more and larger interests at stake. In fact, including, of course, the security of the very NATO members that today are not at war.
Let me just to put a finer point on it, and I take your point, absolutely. But I want to play, this is NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg. He was asked in two different arenas about the potential use of chemical weapons in this arena. And first by our own Andrea Mitchell, and then by our own Lester Holt. So I just want to play those two pieces of sound. Just take a listen.
Any use, for instance, of chemical weapons would totally change the nature of the conflict. It will be a blatant violation of international law, and it will have wide-ranging, severe consequences.
Do you take anything off the table when it comes to responding to chemical weapons?
We are in a very dangerous situation. So if I started to speculate about the different options, I will only make an unpredictable and dangerous situation even more dangerous and even more unpredictable. My main message is that we are there to protect and defend all allies, protect and defend every inch of NATO territory.
You know, Amna Nawaz, I think the challenge that a lot of people have in watching what's happening is that, you know, in the case, for instance, of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the U.S. went to the United Nations and said, well, we know they have chemical and biological weapons, and we suspect they have nuclear weapons. We have to act to stop them from acting. In the case of Syria, we know for sure that they used chemical weapons, that they've used the most vicious treatment and tactics against the citizens of that country in order to preserve the Bashar al-Assad regime. So when the world says that it needs to take military action because we know that chemical or nuclear weapons are on the table, but then in this case, we say, well, we can't do anything because they have chemical and nuclear weapons. It strikes a lot of people as hypocritical. And I wonder if that is the way people are seeing it in countries that have faced us or faced other instances of Russian aggression.
Joy, I think you are centering in on the question that we who cover the White House and who have been in touch with a number of European officials have really been honing in on, which is what would it take? Right? Where is the line if there is so much concern about the use of chemical weapons and there is so much concern about the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons, as we've heard so many officials say now, then where is the line? And you heard the Secretary General state right there, of course we will respond. The chemical weapon deployment would absolutely change the nature of this. Our follow-up question is always, and then what? How will you respond? There's a couple of things at play here, and I'm so glad you raised the issue of Syria because I don't think we talk enough about the fact that there's a very clear and direct line from the Russian intervention in Syria, the brutal aerial bombardment that they played out there, and the fact that the U.S. and the rest of the world failed to respond, even when the Assad regime did deploy those chemical weapons on their own population, because many argue that did empower Putin, and that the same playbook that was deployed in Syria is now being deployed here. And so the questions that we ask are, where are some of those lines? We're starting to see some of those details come out now. I do think the longer this conflict goes on, and the more the U.S. and NATO allies are forced to consider what are the potential actions here, some of those questions we've been asking and continue to ask are starting to get some details around them. When you're providing those defensive weapons, and let's be clear, the White House officials we talked to draw a very clear line between the provision of humanitarian aid and military support and defensive weapon systems, these anti-tank and anti-air systems they're providing, and offensive weapons, or the implementation and enforcement of a no-fly zone, as we know President Zelensky has continued to ask for. They see those as two very different things, one bringing the U.S. into direct conflict with Russia, which is what they are trying to avoid. But we're starting to see some of those details come out. What happens if there is a Russian strike specifically on a NATO convoy that's moving to supply Ukrainian troops? What happens if there is a deployment of a chemical weapon and some kind of radiological or biological chemical cloud ends up drifting into NATO territory? Is that a violation? Is that an attack on a NATO territory? And does that trigger a response? To some degree, this is new territory for many of these leaders because we are now seeing war on the European continent for the first time in 70 years. And these leaders were, many of them, not in place the last time many of these issues were as front and real and imminent as they are right now.